late. Our panel members, you can come up to the stage. It's Tim O'Keefe, who's the CEO of Rossmore, Rita Excel, Executive Director of Australia and New Zealand Driverless Vehicle Initiative, Jennifer Schmitz, Managing Partner of Lattice Industries, and Jimmy Kim should be on the phone remotely. If Jimmy's not here, he's with Verizon. That's nothing to say anything bad about Verizon, but he's not here. And so we'll see if he dials in.
I'm here, Randy.
Oh, yeah, there's my buddy, Jimmy Kim. Okay. All right, we love Verizon, right, Jimmy?
We love Verizon.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have about 6 slides to go over our automated driving system grant. And so if you could queue up those slides, I'd appreciate it. And then I'll moderate this panel. Actually, we have a video first, a AAA video. Let's play that video first.
Welcome to Gomentum Station, a private and secure 2,100-acre proving ground for connected and automated vehicles, conveniently located in Concord, California, 35 miles from San Francisco. We're the nation's largest closed-course AV test track with various environments for repeatable, automated vehicle testing. Engineers from OEMs and AV tech startups use our facility as an integral part of their development process to validate simulator results, perform safety operator training, and test NCAP scenarios and edge cases without risk to the public. Multiple distinct testing zones allow our customers to validate their AV stack in real-world scenarios with a variety of roadways, speed limits, and features such as railroads, city blocks, construction zones, and tunnels. Infrastructure features include programmable traffic signals, merge lanes, traffic circles, and bike lanes, making Gomentum Station an even more versatile space for closed-course testing. Most recently, our Vehicle to Everything, or V2X Lab, opened for traffic engineers to test their connected technology on our DSRC-enabled signals installed at 5 intersections. We also offer a range of automated vehicle testing services that can scale to the size and needs of your operation, including equipment rental, test plan development, engineering support, and result analysis. Gomentum Station is owned and operated by AAA of Northern California, Nevada, and Utah, and is part of our ongoing commitment to safety on the road by enabling the safe development and deployment of AVs. Whether you're testing commercial trucks, passenger fleets, or connected technology, visit us at gomentumstation.net today to see how we can help you meet your AV testing needs.
It's been a great partner to us in our redefining mobility process, and I wanted to thank them. I love that video. So we have a recent grant. We got 2 grants from the United States Department of Transportation last year, and we actually applied for one earlier in my career here. And when I went to Washington, D.C., I talked to Peter Rogoff, and he called me, and he wanted me to be the chair of the National Freight Advisory Committee. I thought he was calling to apologize for not giving the Contra Costa Transportation Authority a grant. And I said, well, your apology is accepted. And he said, I'm not calling you to apologize. You know it's easier to get into Harvard than to get a US DOT grant. And I said, okay. So last year we applied for 2 grants. We applied for an ATC MTD grant, which is, I call it the Innovation Grant. And we were lucky enough to receive that. We got a call on April Fool's Day. I thought it was a joke, one of you playing a trick on me, because we do play tricks on you every now and again. And then we got a call later on the same year, last year, and we were notified that we were one of the recipients of the Automated Driving System Grant. And we are very, very proud of the components, and that's why we assembled this panel to talk to you a little bit about that grant. And so you can see the goals of the grant are very specific. And we've actually cut a deal with the United States Department of Transportation, the Secretary's office, that we're going to work on a couple other things, and remind me at the end if I forget to talk about those 2 issues that we're going to work on. So there's 3 pilot projects involved in the Automated Driving System Grant. The first one is, as you can see, I'm getting older. I've been here 10 years, and my back hurts right now, and my leg is really sore. And So I can walk across the street to the loft or the lot, and I can go down to the city center, but it takes me a long time. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to test the theory that senior citizens would be willing to get into a self-driving vehicle and lower their reliance on a car. And so I gave a presentation. Tim brought some of his citizens here. They had a little group, and they came to visit me, and they said they wanted to have a self-driving shuttle at Rossmore. And I said, well, how much money do you have? And they said, we don't have any money. And they said, but if you find money, can you please include us, because we need your help. And I said, okay. So if we find some money, we'll include you in the project. And so sure enough, we ended up getting money. We called Tim and his group, and they said, oh my God, this is a gift from heaven. Let's test these vehicles out at Rossmore. So Rossmore is about, and I think Tim will go into more detail, but let's say there's a little less than 10,000 senior citizens, average age is 78 years old, and some of the people are choosing not to drive anymore, but they don't have alternatives. Now, I think his transit service ends at 5 o'clock in the evening?
A little later.
6 o'clock? So one of the gentlemen, we're gonna be featured on a PBS documentary, Transit Innovations in San Francisco, and we had 5 of his residents in the Ollie shuttle, and their responses were very, very cute. And I really enjoyed that time I spent with those folks. They're excited about that technology, and I think it's going to help lower their reliance on the single occupant vehicle. So that's pilot project number 1. Lindsay and I went to Los Angeles. The board allowed us to travel down to LA. Thank you to our board members for allowing us to travel. And we did a C-SPAN, a documentary for the city of Los Angeles about innovation in transportation. And we talked about our self-driving vehicle program, and that was taped, and it was a doctor at the county hospital, Dr. Troy Kaji, was working out in Los Angeles, and he saw us on the video. And he said, hey, those people, they work in Contra Costa County. And so we have an absentee problem at our county hospital. Could we use technology to find a way of lowering the absentee rate, which gets people better care, which in the long run equals less cost on society as their issues get more and more major? And so we're going to start out with a partnership with the county hospital to try to use technology, an on-demand service with self-docking wheelchair technology. That's pilot project number 2. So can we lower that absentee rate? We don't have a good partner, Christina. I think I saw you there. Via could be a partner. There's a lot of could-be partners out there. We're trying to set the budget now. Tim Hale's in the back. Jack Hall's right there. They're trying to set up the partnerships, the budget. It's a federally funded grant, so there's a lot of paperwork. And so we're working on that right now. So that's pilot project number 2 that we're going to talk about. And lastly, how many vehicles can operate on a freeway lane in the future, and what do we need to do to enhance that journey? You heard a little bit about that from the first panel, but the idea is today the vehicle or the highway capacity manual says the vehicles are about 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour. So when you model the future, and if Rudy's wrong and not everybody's moving out of California, but some are actually moving in, you look at the models, they say as population grows, all of our roads are going to get more and more congested. So how do we deal with that? So we want to make sure the models are indicative to the future. Not only population growth, but capacity of our roadways. So that's pilot project number 3. And so what we did with USDOT is we said that, and you talked a little bit, you heard a little bit about safety metrics. 40,000 people are killed, 100 people a day are killed on our roadways, 90%, 94% human error. Whatever the number is, a lot of people are being killed on our roadways. And I've been in the transportation business for quite some time. And so in 2005, I remember the number was about 42,500 people killed in the United States. A couple years ago, it was about 40,000. So the number hasn't really changed. And so when we went to USDOT, we've been doing the same thing over and over again. We fund safety projects the same way, and the outcome is still about the same. About 100 people a day are killed on our roadways. And so what we said, if cars have better information, if Tim can get us better information, not all the information, but the data that we need, and we're going to start out with hard braking and skidding, can we become more proactive rather than reactive? Because the current metrics are you kill X amount of people are injured, statistically abnormal. A report comes out to Caltrans districts and they go investigate those sites. So we think we can make a difference and we want to try that. And so that in a nutshell is the ADS grant. We're really proud of that application. We're thankful to Secretary Chow and her people for funding that initiative. And so now we're going to have this panel talk about that. You can't see Jimmy Kim. Jimmy Kim's a good-looking guy. He's in San Francisco. Very, very eager to start this. By the way, our last US DOT grant, it's to build a mobility on demand platform. That notice to proceed took 8 months. That's a warp factor 6 speed with the US DOT. And so we want to try to make sure that that happens again, because I know that sometimes when you sign agreements with the public sector and we say we're going to get going on these projects and it's 2.5 years later, the interest has waned, the support has waned. And so what we want to do is make sure that when you're in, you're in. And so we're going to work on making sure that's expedited. So let's get started. Use the program to ask any questions. I'll try to monitor that either on the screen, but I'm going to have Tim, you want to go first?
Sure.
You have a presentation?
Yep. I'll have to load us up. How do we get their attention?
They'll load can you load up Tim O'Keefe's presentation?
There we go. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, I'm assuming that most people probably have heard of Rossmoor, but you probably don't really know what it's all about. I'm going to describe for you what Rossmoor is and some of the reasons why people move there, and then why we think autonomous vehicles might be a great solution for the future, for seniors in particular. So first up, the history of Rossmoor. Developer back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, recognized that there was one segment of the population that was not being paid attention to at all for home builders. And so he keyed in on that, saw this as an opportunity that seniors are being ignored. So he came up with this concept called Rossmoor Leisure World. And he opened the first Rossmoor, but it was not a retirement community, in an area of Orange County called Rossmoor. It's down near Los Alamitos, just inland from Seal Beach, if you're familiar with that area down in Orange County. But he had this concept, and he opened these Rossmoor Leisure Worlds in 2 in Southern California, here in Walnut Creek, Arizona, Maryland, and I think there was New Jersey, thank you. So he had these all around the country, and this was at the forefront of community development. Very, very few homeowners associations existed in the United States at the time. About 5,000 total in the entire country. California had a few hundred. So this is the very, very beginning. Today, there's more than 500,000 homeowners associations. So way ahead of his time. So Rossmoor, the development began when he bought the Stanley Dollar property, 2,000 acres between Walnut Creek and Lafayette in 1964, and began the development. And this was actually from marketing literature that I pulled. His model was to create self-contained communities, offering every facet of rewarding living and placing them within the reach of the average individual over the age of 45. There was no definition back at that time of what a senior was. It wasn't part of the legal definitions that Congress and the state of California had adopted yet. So he felt 45 and above, that's the retirement lifestyle. And you also have to keep in mind that people didn't live that long back then. I mean, they lived 45 years, but the people about 60, 65, that was about the average lifespan back at that time. So then his idea was to provide a resort-style living, including housing, amenities, and medical care. So that didn't last. The medical care component lasted about 3-4 years and became completely unsustainable, and so they stopped offering that as one of the services. But this is what Rossmoor looks like today. These are 2 of our community facilities that were built, one about 7 years ago, one about 8 years ago. The housing construction concluded in 2005, so it took 40 years to build out Rossmoor. It has the minimum age now by law is 55, not 45. It's what's called independent living, and what that means is that people come in, they buy their home in Rossmoor, and so they own their own home, and we don't provide any care services. So if they need assisted living in some fashion, they're on their own. They have to get that and hire their own private assistant or whatever, personal caregiver. So this is an independent, active adult community designed for active adults. 6,700 units, about just under 10,000 residents. Very, very few rentals. You can rent in Rossmoor, but it's discouraged. So there's 19 homeowners associations, and they would prefer that the owners live there. So there's very, very little in the way of renting. There, as I said, 19 homeowners associations. The trustee, so this is, again, in the age before homeowners associations were common. They set up all the common facilities, the roads, the clubhouses are all set up in a trust. The Golden Rain Foundation is my employer. They are the trustee that manage the common areas in the community. And we manage all the homeowners associations as well, except for one. One homeowner association is self-managed. And we have 250 employees. So that's what Rossmore is. Now I'm going to share with you, just by the numbers, this is what it is. The average age is 77, 2,000 acres, 6 clubhouses, golf courses, libraries, swimming pools. It has everything. It is so much fun to live there. You have to work hard to be bored because there's so much stuff going on. Randy mentioned we have our own bus service. We operate 12 buses, 14 miles of private roads, 200 clubs. Lots of the whole place is driven by club activity. There's a club for literally everything. Your political persuasions, your religious persuasions, what kind of card games you like to play, or whatever. Travel clubs, all kinds of things. Just some interesting tidbits. 350 fire hydrants that we own, 434 streetlights, which we're in the process of converting to LED. And when you think about that, that's $1,400 a head to replace those. So we're looking at about $1 million roughly to retrofit everything for LED. We just opened our 1 megawatt solar farm in November. And this was something interesting. We tabulated for last year in 2019, 1,269 tons of recycled stuff, not including grass clippings and things like that. So concrete, wood, cardboard, dirt, all that kind of stuff. We try to be very, very conservation-minded in the Rossmore community. And this is part 2 of the numbers. 22,000 dial-a-bus rides, 32,000 facility bookings last year. It's a busy place, 40,000 maintenance calls, 52,000 rounds of golf, 67,000 rides on our bus, 250,000 visits to our fitness center, which we just recently opened, a $10 million renovation of our fitness center 2 years ago. 3.5 million gate accesses in 2019. So that's about 10,000 cars a day come through our front gate. Busy, busy, busy place. So why do residents want to live there? I think the primary reason is that you've worked your whole life and you want to be retired. You want to enjoy retirement. And what better thing to do than you can retire and stay in your home and go on a cruise? That's not such a good thing right now. Or you can buy into a place like Rossmore and have all this fun all the time. You want somebody else to take care of your house now. You don't want to have to, you're tired of that. You're tired of painting, you're tired of the yard work, you're tired of taking care of the roof. Let somebody else take care of that. So that's one of the values and one of the primary reasons people move here. They want to stay active, stimulated, engaged. As I said, 32,000 room reservations in our clubhouse facilities last year. Most of those are club activities. Residents rent the rooms for parties, wakes, funerals, weddings, all kinds of stuff. We have speakers. We were supposed to have Nancy Pelosi's daughter speak at Rossmore on Monday, but we canceled pretty much all large gatherings like this just because of the fear of coronavirus. In fact, I raced over here because we just published a whole new set of guidelines for the community around group gatherings and all that based on public health officials' recommendations. But they want to be engaged and challenged, and that's why they move into Rossmore. And then I think the other thing, we get about 60% of our residents from the local area. That means 40% are coming from areas outside of the Bay Area. They're coming from literally all over the world and moving into Rossmore, and usually because they have family nearby. They've got kids and grandkids in Lafayette or Walnut Creek or Orinda, and that's what they want to be close. And they discover this place, and it's a fraction of the cost of living outside the gate of Rossmore. You can still find homes in there for less than $300,000. So it's a great, great value. Now, here's the challenges of getting older, and this is what I think, which we're going to lead to as to why this is important and this particular initiative. As we get older, we're all going to get faced with this, every one of us. Vision, hearing, mobility issues, aches and pains. Randy said, the knee hurts, the hip hurts. And I got to tell you, I'm beyond old enough to live there, and I swear every single day there's new aches and pains when I get out of bed in the morning. And then you have these other conditions that afflict primarily the older population: depression, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. These are a lot of issues, and unfortunately, when you're living in a community like Rossmore that's independent living without the provision of care unless you get it on your own, you age in place. And so you might have moved in and been healthy and vibrant and active at, say, 65 years old, and now you're 90, 95 years old, or 100 or 105, and you love living there, but you can't get around anymore, or you're suffering from some of these things. And as we get older, we suffer a lot of loss. Loss in our lives, our spouses, our partners, our children pass away, our friends, and as you get older, less and less of those people that you knew and loved are around you any longer. If you were living independently somewhere else out in the community, you may fall into depression, and these things can compound themselves, and you become isolated. So being in a community like Rossmore, you have a lot of emotional support from friends. You have fear and anxiety about a lot of stuff when we get older. You're going to be afraid that you're going to run out of money. Your retirement, if you didn't save enough money, you're out of money. And that can happen. It's not inexpensive to live in Rossmore. Our monthly fees are relatively high. You're afraid of being on the road. You're afraid of getting in your car. You're afraid of driving the car. You're afraid of getting out of your car, parking your car in a parking lot where you can't turn your head to the left or the right very well. Your hearing might not be so good. Your eyesight might be so good. I mean, one of our regular occurrences, the issues that I deal with nearly every single day, are people getting hit in the parking lot, and the hit and runs. So somebody's embarrassed. They don't want to leave a note. They skedaddle out of there, and then the other person comes out to their car, and they see their car damaged. It happens all the time in a community like Rossmore. Loss of independence is probably the single biggest fear. As we get older, you're afraid that as you recognize that you can't see or hear quite as well as you used to. You know that, but you don't want to admit it. Many people don't want to admit it. But say you've lost your spouse or your partner, and you're living by yourself, and you know that your faculties are declining, and staying independent is absolutely critical. You don't want to go to one of those old folks' homes. You don't want your family to see you like this kind of a thing. And so you're afraid to acknowledge that you hit a car. You're afraid to acknowledge that you can't quite turn your head or your back, or whatever the issues are. So you don't want to tell your doctor. You don't want to tell your family. This happens all the time. So this fear, this loss of independence is so important to seniors. And in a place like Rossmore, with our bus service, most people that use it are those that have given up their keys, either voluntarily or had them taken away. But this allows them to get to the doctor. It allows them to get to the hospital, to get to the grocery store. Our bus takes you to all these places, even downtown to the movie theater, or to BART, to get on BART to go to the city. So you can still remain independent and not be as mobile as you used to be by living in Rossmore. So that there's that fear, that loss of independence. So this is what happens, autonomous vehicles. This is why we're excited about this. We had Sebastian Thrun came to Rossmore 2 years ago. He is recognized as one of the inventors of the autonomous vehicles. He won the DARPA challenge, which is the Defense Department's challenge grant that they put out for universities and corporations to meet. And the challenge that year was to drive an autonomous vehicle across the Mojave Desert, 132 miles across the Mojave Desert. He was a professor at Stanford. He was very young. He's about 35 years old at the time. And he won the grant. And he drove an autonomous vehicle all the way across the Mojave Desert. Now, you might think, well, that's easy. It's just a bunch of sand. But it's not. There's actually mountains, and there's roads that they had to navigate and the whole thing. So he did that. He came to Rossmore. We had standing room only event to hear him speak. And the crowd gave him a standing ovation. They were excited about it, which is what really inspired me to reach out to Randy and say, hey, when I had read about the Bishop Ranch Autonomous Project, I said, we've got a great opportunity here, I think, for you to test vehicles in our community. We have 14 miles of private roads. They are smooth like butter, much calmer and quieter, and there's no cracks in the roads, not like we have in the real world. It's a great place to test these kinds of vehicles. Doesn't have any street lights, but we have a number of street signs, and obviously we have a lot of walkers and people in wheelchairs and whatever that are navigating, and that these vehicles hopefully don't run into anybody. But this is why we're excited about this. It would allow seniors to remain independent longer. It would provide transportation after hours. As I'd mentioned, Randy cited that we do close our bus service down. It doesn't run around the clock. It closes around 6:30 at night. So, but our shows typically start at 7 or 7:30 in the evening. We've got concerts and speakers and whatever. And if you don't have a way to get there and you can't get there on the bus, you don't have a way to get home. Or if you get there on the bus, you get there early, you got to figure out a way to get home. And this would provide that solution. And finally, it's going to make our roadways safer. Residents are concerned. There are a lot of, I wouldn't say there's a lot of accidents in our community. There's a lot of fear of accidents in our community. Everybody, I hear it all the time. People are upset. They saw somebody speeding in the community. Our speed limits are 25 miles an hour intentionally because we allow golf carts on our streets. And by law, we're allowed to do that under California state law. And the police department does enforce the motor vehicle code inside the gates of Rossmore. So that's the introduction to Rossmore and why we think autonomous vehicle, this solution would be great for seniors and testing it here in the Rossmore community.
Great, thank you, Tim. Jennifer has a presentation, short presentation. So let me add a couple factoids while they load that up. Go ahead and you can get ready. Tim and I went to Cal Poly together. He went, so he's probably older than I am. I'm pretty young. So that's one. He roomed with a friend of mine, Jay Walter, who's a civil engineer. So that's how small this world is. If it works in Rossmore, it works in Trilogy, where Mayor Taylor has been bugging us or suggesting to us that we look for an opportunity for his senior citizens. And I'm pretty sure Councilmember Bursan, Councilmember Xavier, and Councilmember Haskew, you're all worried about how do you take care of the citizens. So if it works here, we think it can be piloted elsewhere. And then you don't have to actually change your streetlights over and pay for it yourself. You could actually enter into a partnership with some companies as long as you put certain criteria in that poll. They'll do that for free. So if we can cut you a deal, can we get half of the savings? Like, you know, so we're looking for more money, right? We're looking for another.
We're already rolling.
You're already rolling? Oh,
PG&E's got a program that we are working with.
I'm trying to negotiate for more money. You know, go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry, I'm cutting into your time.
That's okay. Speaking of money, that's what we're here for,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right.
Okay.
Money and data.
Money and data.
And what's data worth?
Okay, so we're the ones that everybody wants to talk to when we talk about this information, this infrastructure, these autonomous cars, the V2I, the V2V. Everything here is about data. And what Lattice does is we took a look at every way a network is set up. And we came up with the fact that private companies are very greedy. Public entities have no money. So there's that third element that came out in the conversation before this one, and it was called the P3. So what we do at Lattice is we focus on coming up with solutions all revolving around data, but in a network and in a system that works for the entities in which we are looking to do this job for. Okay. First thing that we look at is in this regional data exchange solution, which is what it really is. You're going to have car companies talking to sensors that are on the streets, perhaps people counters, perhaps other information coming through that might even be medical, okay? The infrastructure is very, very important. It has to do basically these four topics here. The first one is it has to be secure and self-sustaining. Now, when I say self-sustaining, I mean money. Okay, the problem is just as we heard before, tax money is going down. Opportunity for tax money is going down. Actually, citizens are getting irritated by all the things that have been taken away. So relying on tax money is not exactly the best way to do it. So we have other opportunities such as private-public partnerships that we'll take a look into in a little bit. The second portion is what is really important to the actual people who are going to communicate across this network. They're what we call data stakeholders. Every one of us in this room is a data stakeholder. The reason being is we're the ones that create the data. So to each of us, we have to have a reason to do this. And a lot of the reason for most of these companies to actually work together and collaborate, which is a rare thing, is the fact that they're all paying the same price. They have to build the infrastructure, they have to store the data, they have to communicate with each other, and by the way, they have to take the liability if they're breached. Okay, so big thing, we have to work on that. The third thing is that we need to standardize that data. For transmission purposes, there's a timing issue. You really don't want those autonomous cars not talking to the light system. Bad things can happen. So this has to be done in a real time or a near real time in some instances. In other instances, the data can be warehoused, brought about for, say, analytical purposes to learn about a new braking system per se. But to access that data, it may not be our database over here or our database over there. Those two databases are owned by separate entities, so they need to communicate. So what we have to do is we have to build a system that actually works for everyone. And it's very hard, but it's been done before. We have to provide that value back to all those stakeholders, or there's no way people are going to adopt it. There's no way people are going to pay for it, and there's no way that this is actually going to work. But good news is it's happened before. One of the key things that Randy's working on is mobility as a service. This is that on-demand mobility that we'll have. And at the underlying element of all these things that we're talking about, whether it's in Rossmore, whether it's on the GoMentum station, whether it's out on I-680, what we have to do is we have to realize that this is more than just one element. We have to realize that this is going to take artificial intelligence. It's going to take network information from unrelated networks. The car company networks, the PG&Es that own the light poles that are going into Rossmore, the Ollie buses that have their own information, they all need to talk to each other so that we become more efficient, that we can stem innovation, and then we can provide a reason to go ahead with this whole autonomous rebuild of what is going to be our transportation agencies across the United States. So what we look at is data. And my team is a bunch of data scientists that love a problem. We have a deep understanding of data because we came from where they made money off of data, and that would be the payment industry. But we also realize that no network that's built is going to sustain itself unless there is what they call adoption. In the way that we have this, people who adopt to networks have to have that reason that we spoke of before. Well, let's talk about the different types of data that different elements can be added and what kind of burden can be released by these, what we are going to call members. So first, you have the car companies. Each one of those car companies stores their information, or a train company in Australia, or a CCTA, all has information. That can be combined to be valuable. You'll hear that your data is not valuable, keep your open data systems, but at the end of the day, cities, agencies, companies who provide open data, there's a cost. And that cost is a burden to every single one of these stakeholders. So when we talk about using P3s, what we're going to be talking about is actually taking care of these elements that you see here, okay? Because P3s, public-private entities, enter into a partnership, and they're allowed to go a little bit further than they would on their own. Private companies can do this all day, but how many people are mad that Facebook is entering into their lives way too much, and they know the exact next move that you're going to make based on the conversations you had? That bothers me. I don't know if it bothers anybody else. Share hands. Okay, they know more about me than I know about myself. The next thing we're going to talk about is what they call edge computing. Edge computing is something that can relieve burden, but these things are expensive for individual companies or entities to take part in. There are companies like Intel that sit out and help us calculate some of the information so that we don't have to store it all. But on the storage, we also have to realize each one of these companies have to pay for edge computing. Each one of these systems are going to have edge computing. Additionally, we're going to have that data storage and that data access. So when the car company wants to talk to PG&E to make sure that they can go through that light, there's got to be storage of that information, historical and real time. All these things are very, very expensive. And unfortunately, if we don't have a way to make them self-sustaining, in the future, that infrastructure gets aged, like the roadways. You've heard about the problems with the transportation agencies, right? Well, if you think it's bad enough that a roadway isn't getting the maintenance or the new products that you probably have, imagine an autonomous bus servicing seniors. Okay, so all the time, reinvestment must occur. It has to. The largest systems in the world always have the bulk of their budgets going right back into the infrastructure. And that's whether if they're for-profit or nonprofit. A public-private partnership at the best place in this system is what we would call a data exchange. And a data exchange, if we think about it, very similar. You've heard the term data is a commodity. I 100% believe that data is a commodity. In fact, I'm so sure it's a commodity that I think that what we should do is model off of things that have been done in history before. In the 1600s, there was this problem with tulips in Amsterdam. Tulips are so expensive that they actually had to create an exchange for everybody to trade them so they can get a fair and open market price. I mean, at the time before this exchange, tulips cost what would cost the same as a mansion on the Amsterdam Canal. It was crazy, it was whatever. So they decided, oh, wait, we need some way to be fair and have an open exchange, a marketplace that every single person can come and give their tulips. That idea was adopted through the years, and it slowly became what we call the futures and commodities markets. In later half of the 1800s, they created the Chicago Board of Trade, which also traded commodities. The reason for this was there was so much of these pigs and hogs and wheats But everybody had contracts to exchange these things that had prices way up here, way down here. There was no regulation that we talk about, okay? In the system that we're thinking of now with the transportation agencies, we're going to be able to solve a couple things as we build this out. First off, we're going to provide an open marketplace for stakeholders, inventors, innovation guys, PG&E, people with energy, and the car companies to come and take a look at what we have to be able to exchange their data. As they cross that data, and it goes over what is going to necessarily be the network routes, there's an opportunity in a very similar fashion to create a hub in the center where this information can be exchanged, but the best way to do it is in a public-private partnership. The reason for the public-private partnership is two things. One, private companies know how to do it better. My background and most of my team come from a payments industry network that's very global, and we were at the forefront of artificial intelligence and being able to monetize data. But what we learned was your data has value, but what's more important, it needs railroad tracks. As it goes over those railroad tracks, it's going to have to go through and be directed, similar to the way that you do a switchboard. And as that data is being directed to the person that has requested it or the person who needs to push it to somewhere else, those lines can be used as what would we call a digital toll road. And going back to the previous P3 conversation, that digital toll road can be a way to actually start to generate revenue. If the members come along and they're generating revenue on this by being paid back as members, collectively using what we call a unified system, instead of having cybersecurity over here, data storage over here, data networking over here, and then cybersecurity over here, data storage over here, data networking over here, what we can do is combine those elements into one system. And this is what we call the adoption. As people start to use this system, just as riders start to use I-680, more and more information starts to be accumulated on every sense. Additionally, now we have the opportunity to exchange that. The way that this system can actually pay for itself is the same way that many commodities exchanges pay for themselves today. It's what we call a clearing and settlement fee. It's a way to take the costs of these stakeholders and build it into a system that actually works. And as people travel over this system, we can start to generate revenue that helps support the infrastructure reinvestment, as well as, and perhaps, include other adoptions from perhaps non-transportation members. For example, you have your senior sitting in Rossmore who wants to get to wherever they need to go, perhaps the doctor's office. Well, as they go, first off, we need to know the route, which is going to require some GPS, right? Then we're going to need that autonomous car that needs to get to that. And perhaps, before we get to that doctor's office, perhaps there's a way to actually include the HIPAA information that's required on that person. Now, these are privacy laws and other things that people always worry about, but this is the reality of the world we have. So as we build this infrastructure, one of the key things we need to do is make sure that it has an ability to help set standards. In the financial exchange world, members come to an exchange, there's benefits. They take care of some of the business they don't want to be in. For instance, in this case, small businesses that are starting out with technologies for cars, the small business auto developer, is not going to be able to put up the same kind of dough that a Ford or a Chevrolet can do when they're developing autonomous cars. And the market does actually keep them out because the cost is so high, the regulation. But if members come to an exchange, they can actually work together to create services that are offered by a centralized place, which would be affordable for these members to use, to share their data, and to expand that infrastructure. The infrastructure, data, and everything that exchanges upon it has to be ethical. Because guess what? Nobody looks at the Wall Street guys and thinks, wow, they're just the most ethical and they're thinking of the citizen. That doesn't happen, okay? What we're dealing with is something that actually has lives at stake. If these cars don't communicate, they crash, okay? Whether that's vehicle to vehicle, which may be the technology, or it might be vehicle to infrastructure, which may be the technology, or maybe some technology we don't know in the future. So the idea is not only do you create that infrastructure, it's got to be agnostic. We don't know if Bluetooth or LiDAR or any technology that's going to come in the future is actually going to be here in 2050 when most people will live in cities. So what we have to do is be able to adapt to that. Again, that would require revenue and innovation. The other section of this is when we create those standards, if we want to go from I-680 to I-880 to perhaps even one day 101, we're going to have systems that actually talk to each other. And that's what we call interoperable and interconnectable. To do this, you have to start across literally the nation and hopefully the world one day to create standards of which elements of data can be exchanged in a metadata form, that these things can be brought out, that we can learn from each other, and that people are okay exchanging. A lot of what people are okay to exchange is if there's a benefit for them. So let's talk about benefits. There has to be many things involved in actually creating benefits for an exchange. There has to be self-regulation. Nobody really wants the government to come in and say, hey, do this, don't do that. It doesn't work. Look at what Facebook and Google are facing today. At this point, they know that the next step is the government to put the kibosh on half the stuff they're gathering. And it's one political election away. And that's what's going on in the state of California. In Europe, people say the standards are too tight, that it's actually going to crush some of the innovation. But in a way where organizations can actually regulate themselves, they actually start to work together for the benefit of the entire ecosystem. And this is proven by the financial markets today. Those members on those stock exchanges just don't sit there to do nothing. What they do is they work together, and when they come in with issues, kind of like the other day, unfortunately, when the S&P 500 had to stop trading, but there was limits set from their previous experience. And then the federal government, the state governments, everybody goes to them in situations that are bad like this and asks their advice. And those are the things that help to form policies. What we're trying to do here is to understand what everybody's process is, because that's what it takes. And everybody in a coalition of players, of stakeholders, has to get together to actually agree to try the system. Now, there's benefits to this that people don't think of. For instance, if a car company wants to share with, say, the CCTA, their information, nobody really wants to actually hold it, because if it gets breached, whose fault is it? So another element of doing a P3 and public-private partnership is they form this into a separate entity. That entity itself then can also offset some of the liability. And if you put that entity in the core of the network, you may be able to build out what we call a central core that is good for cybersecurity. Cybersecurity requires endpoint cybersecurity, network cybersecurity, and core cybersecurity. However, if you were to bring that and mutualize that expense in the center, you start to relieve the burden out to the endpoints. And those are the sensors in the car companies. Those are the streets. These are people's information that might be HIPAA related. But the idea here is we start to economize all the stakeholders' issues into one entity that help relieve the burden and mutualize the cost. The setup to this is very similar to any type of commodities exchange. You're going to have your members, you're going to have your non-members. Members are usually those folks who want to trade the most data and want to share the most things with each other in a situation that makes sense, in a regional situation in this point, okay? So for instance, if you were going to put a data exchange in the middle of Rossmore, one of the things you'd want to do is make sure the buses were talking to the lights and perhaps knew the addresses of the people, and then they knew the doctors and where they need to go, and things can be set up and scheduled, and efficiency starts to build in. And these are even things you can learn on. Perhaps you need another Olympic-sized swimming pool to make these people more healthy, because you're going to learn from the doctors who are sharing their information. And it feeds onto itself and it builds onto itself. Very similar to commodities markets that we see, because one of the things that is most important to them is the pricing of these contracts. The data that people want to share costs money. And I mean, just to get it from point A to B, forget what its actual value is at this point, let's just talk A to B. So if we can mutualize those expenses amongst all the players, it starts to help to build a sustainable and basically inviting network to come and play with. One of the typical things that we see is in the development of technologies and infrastructure, and this goes and leans on to Randy's point, this is something that you have to start. You have to start today, because guess what? Europe is already far in advance. I've spoken to people in the Middle East, Australia, where they have these better beneficial ways of doing things through these public-private partnerships, and they move a lot quicker. The United States is behind. We actually now need to leapfrog over what we have done. We're in a critical crisis where we don't have the best cybersecurity. We have private entities having our data. We have public entities having our data. And by the way, when it gets breached, who pays? Here's a question. Anybody know who pays when any entity gets breached? We do. At the end of the day, we do. The information is being used. It's our information. It's being used by other entities. And by the way, they're going to make a ton of money on it. And if it gets breached, oh, it's too bad, so sad. And that's what happens now. And people are starting to get upset over this because at the end of the day, we got to spend time to redo our own identification. So as we move in this project and other projects, these are the kind of core things that need to be considered for the financial benefit to make these systems sustainable. And that's what we're doing.
Thank you. Jimmy, you have anything to add from San Francisco?
Hey, Randy, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. How's it going?
Good.
That's Jimmy Kim right
no,
there.
I'm really, I apologize that I can't be there in person, but nothing to, be able to influence. The corporates got me all sort of grounded here. So I'll try to enjoy the festivities vicariously through you all. But anyway, no, I think Jennifer actually does bring up some really, really good points about data and the exchange of the data. And, I think that, this is sort of the conundrum that we're in right now. I think the positive story here is that we've got an opportunity to come together as an industry, right? So really looking at how we can set up these public-private partnerships to facilitate the exchange of the data and really understand, okay, who gets the benefit, what services are provided, and, to Jennifer's point, how can we actually get these networks and this data to be adopted at scale? But you got to start somewhere, right? So, we keep hearing stories about the innovation that some of these transit agencies, DOTs are spearheading things like the Open Mobility Foundation. I think it remains to be seen, what level of adoption that these initiatives drive. We're, from a Verizon standpoint, we're open to partnering with all of these different entities. In fact, we've actually made some progress in, adopting some of these public-private partnership frameworks, and we'll be the first ones to tell you that, we're just once sort of spoke in this cog. And so, I think the devil's in the details, but, we're in the sort of the initial stages of this journey, literally. And I think what Jennifer's talking about is, kind of building up to this sort of very sophisticated network. It's going to take some time, right? I think the key here, though, is to really kind of put together the right partnerships to start to learn from some of these proof of concepts. And the other aspect of this is really around trust, right? Let's learn to trust each other and kind of begin with the goal in mind that we're here to address the pain points of the community at large. And I think that's something that we just need to kind of keep in mind as we, try to drive this innovation.
Yeah, Jimmy brings up a great point about partnerships. And so I'm getting some questions. They'll be up on the screen here very shortly. And I'm going to ask a few because we have about 25 minutes left. But I want to ask Rita to start this off. So you've heard, she's from Australia. We're a recent member of the Australian-New Zealand Automated Driving System Initiative and Automated Driverless Vehicle Initiative.
Well done.
Thank you.
Close.
In those two countries. And she's here to kind of, we promised her that we'd try to give her kind of a glimpse into the future. Australia is starting down the path of trying to create a regulatory framework. I think this is a good pilot project that will help Australians as well as Americans. So give us your thoughts about what it's going to take to implement something like this in Australia. I know that's a big question, but I know you can handle it.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Habib and Randy for inviting me again this year. Last year when I was here, you were talking about the I-680 project, about the ADS grants. It really piqued my curiosity about what that would mean. And in Australia, you know, we don't have federal grants, we have state grants, and so each state has been offering $10 million grants around a range of projects. So we've got some lessons that we can learn and we can share. So this is our traditional data exchange, you know, with words and discussion. A lot of these projects are tied up with a lot of NDAs and commercial in confidence, so it's really important to be able to have an exchange so that we don't start and repeat the same mistakes that we've all made. I think fundamentally the big issue is about how do we get more capacity out of our existing infrastructure rather than building our way out of this. So very interested in that particular aspect. And then how do we reduce the number of cars on the road as well and not have negative consequences? When I come to San Francisco, you know, one side of the road is a car park. So it doesn't matter, you know, if it's a car park, it doesn't matter how, it's not moving. So that's a real issue. All those weaving maneuvers, you know, how can technology actually create a safer environment around that? So, you know, to your point around we call them lifestyle villages in Australia, not retirement, because nobody retires in Australia, everybody likes to work. It's really important to understand that people are living longer, they're living healthier, and one of the barriers to people stopping work is about being able to get to work. And, you know, people, my generation and older, they're not necessarily a telecommuting generation, so they're more of a physical arrive at work and do your job. So I think that's really important. So as we age, we're still going to be working, we're active, and we're contributing to the economy. So these are some really important things. And we've had shuttles, similar shuttles in lifestyle villages, in a traditional old folks' home where people are quite infirm. So there's some lessons that, you know, we can share around that.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. So speaking about lessons, one of the questions was about what best practices / learnings can you share about the partnership? And so on both of our grants, we've included a reporting requirement, and we've listed UC Berkeley as a agency to help us combine all the information, lesson learned, and then make sure that we send that information out. I want to tell Maynard that he's over there that, you know, we met at the AV America meeting summit, and he was questioning the vastness of our request because he was on a couple teams that unfortunately didn't get funded. Correct? Yes, at LA and I believe Los Angeles, San Francisco. We're not rubbing it in right now. We're just stating fact. But the point here is that we want to get the word out, and UC Berkeley has some rules that haven't really kept up with some of these issues we're faced with. And so I'm just saying we may come to you in the near term because we want to report on and get the lessons learned out. And we know that you're a very level, kind of non-biased reporting agency. I love Rand, and so stay tuned, Maynard. I think he's not here because of that, but I like to just point that out to him. So that's one of the questions that we want to try to make sure that the word gets out. And one of the other questions is why Verizon? Why does Verizon want to be involved in an automated driving system grant? I think they're also involved in our mobility on demand. So maybe Jimmy spent some time, you know, what prompted you to get involved in our grant?
Yeah, so Randy, that's a really good question. We had the opportunity to collaborate with a number of agencies on this grant application and other grants. And you know that you know, this has sort of been a work in progress, but it's taken many months. But I think I wanted to highlight the things that really stood out about CCTA, and what really got us excited about working with you all is there's a couple of factors. One is just kind of looking at things from a very holistic and methodical perspective, right? So I think that the work that went into the application was just super well thought out. You know, we looked at all different sort of aspects of, you know, what we're trying to do here, not just from the approach, but also looking at, you know, the end result, right? You know, it's easy to focus on the technical details and the emphasis on data collection and management. We were talking a little bit about that this morning, but I think the agency, you and the team, really made it a point to clearly articulate your vision and end in mind, which I think was really helpful. I mean, what are the real-world benefits of utilizing automated, automated driving systems to bring affordable transportation to the underserved communities, as well as address the region's challenges with congestion? Holistic approach, right? You guys all put together a really tight story around how you could leverage existing assets like the Momentum Station, right, to do the proper testing and staging before deploying the technology to real-life urban settings. And then I also think that it was really great that through the selection of all these different locations, you are able to help accelerate adoption across multiple jurisdictions. And these are all things that, the factors that we have to take into consideration when we talk about scaling this kind of operation, right? And doing it in a very controlled manner, but very deliberate, right? So I think, that whole sort of holistic and methodical approach was definitely, something that really excited us. And then the other thing that really was a differentiator was just the brain trust of the right partners, right? So Randy, you and the team actually did a really great job of bringing together partners representing all the critical players, essentially, in the ecosystem. You're talking about the technology companies, the communication providers like us, the OEMs, the academic institutions, with your relationship with UC Berkeley, and consultants at AMG that would actually help analyze the data, and all the other local agencies that need to support the implementation. And it wasn't like you actually brought these people at the last minute together, right? Because it rarely works that way. You're developing these relationships. You're leveraging the relationships that you've cultivated over years, and it came together very systematically. So I think that was really another important factor. And then lastly, it's all about relationships and political capital too, right? So, it's important that we have the right team and the right approach and the right assets, but you can have all those things, but it's really the relationships that actually sell. And, so although, CCT is a relatively small organization, I think Verizon was really impressed to see the kinds of relationships they had at both the local and national levels, with key decision makers and influencers. So, yeah, I think we did have the opportunity to engage different agencies in this and other grants, and a lot of the times it was just, the situation where we'd be approached at the last minute, and agencies were trying to cobble stuff together at the 11th hour. And while we really appreciate the interest in the partnership, rarely does this approach actually deliver a successful outcome. So with this grant, I think Randy and team were tracking this for an extensive period, and we had the chance to collectively formulate our plan over many months, and including the experience that we had with teaming with you on other grants. I think that was a learning experience, right? So I think, Randy, you often joke that Verizon is often a bigger bureaucracy than some of the public agencies, and I got to admit to that. But yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I live and breathe this challenge almost on a daily basis, but this is why we thought it was that much more important for us to do the planning and preparation ahead of time. And I think that's a really key learning. It actually gave us a chance to get to know each other and capitalize on our strengths, and we put together the project management controls and cadence to tightly coordinate the efforts across all these different partners involved in the project. And I think that discipline actually paid off in the end. And we're looking forward to working with all the other partners and folks that are at the table today.
Yeah, economic growth is a big part of that, so thank you for that answer. I have a question about how will Rossmore's residents overcome their fears and actually ride in an autonomous vehicle? That's a pretty good question.
So when I mentioned Sebastian Thrun when he came and spoke to the community a couple years ago, he demonstrated with some videos how the technology works, and people stood up, gave him a standing ovation, the whole deal. And then at the end, he said, after he had everybody sit down, he said, "All right, now tell me how many of you are ready for autonomous vehicles now?" And they all got up on their feet again, and they all applauded. And he pointed out one guy in the middle of the room who did not. And so when everybody sat down, he said, "Sir, can I ask you why you didn't just stand up? Why won't you get into an autonomous vehicle?" And he said, "You are not going to pry my fingers from my 1965 red Ford Mustang." So there will be some people who just won't do it on that principle. There will be, I'm sure, many, many others who will be frightened of the technology. But what he demonstrated to us, which at some point we would like you to demonstrate to our community when the technology is ready and we're ready to roll with this thing, it's to show them how safe this really is, how much safer it is than regular human beings getting behind the wheel of a car, especially seniors that have compromised faculties in some fashion or mobility.
This is a great point. Thank you. You want to add anything else?
Just our experience around that is, so Australia's ready to move from what we call a sandbox to, commercialisation. So we've had these pilots and trials, but now what we're doing is asking those people that have been involved in those trials is, how does this stack up commercially for you? So that's one thing I'd say is that it's one thing to offer things for free and at no cost to trial, but it really comes down to, how do you scale this in a commercial sense that people can afford? And for lifestyle villages or retirement villages, it's about how do you build the cost into the service that they get when they come in there. So it's not a choice. It's an offer, just like your swimming pools and all the rest of the facilities. That's really the important thing about looking at the pilot, but then look about how you scale it and commercialize it.
You're also doing polling. You're polling high school kids. You got approval when I was there last year to start polling all the way down to elementary. 13 years old. And so you're here because we want access to that data. So this is part data question, but talk a little bit about the polling that you've done and the customer acceptance. And as you get younger, is the acceptance greater than as you age?
Sure. So we've been running a longitudinal study since 2016. We poll about 6,000 people across Australia and New Zealand. So that figure is statistically represented. We have a couple of universities that are involved in our research, and the Australian Road Research Board, that's my employer. So what we've been finding and what we've been tracking, and we work with Volpe over here and share data with them, is that back when we started in 2016, everybody was really enthusiastic. There was a high acceptance about these are going to be safer than a driven vehicle. And particularly people who are aging, people with a disability, something like an 85% acceptance rate that they wanted to see the technology and usher that in. So we thought, right, we've got a great pathway. Fast forward to 2019 when we ran our longitudinal study, that dropped. Like the public acceptance expectation is dropped of this technology. Is that because the investment's gone down in, from the technology sense? No way. That's, growing exponentially. It's two things. One is they hear all the negative press around the technology, and it hasn't lived up to their expectation. They were expecting to see it, in 2018 or something like that. So we've got to manage how we converse. But, we because of ethics approval, we only surveyed 18s and above. So I asked my team, I said, well, what are the people who've never thought about driving? The 12, 13-year-olds, what do they think? And so they wanted to do focus groups. And I said, well, my kids would never go to a focus group. They only use Instagram and all these other methods. Let's use that technology that they use. So we launched it on Instagram, and we presented it at the conference, and we had all these high school students there, and I was so proud of the presentation. And the high school students stood up and said, oh, we don't use Instagram, we use TikTok. And I had never heard of TikTok. Who knew that was coming? So that was a great way to start the plenary session. But the results are interesting. We used Instagram. We used that to poll over 18s and under 18s. Went to navigate through ethics approval to be able to talk to 13-year-olds without their parents' consent. Then Greta Thunberg came up and a few other, young kids that had very strong views, and we used that as an example of the fact that, I think 13-year-olds have probably got really strong opinions. We only asked them 5 questions, so we got through that ethics approval. So we'll publish this in the scientific journal. So it's not just a marketing tool. This is a scientific survey of 13 to 18-year-olds. We believe it's the first time it's been done in the world, targeting these youth and asking these questions. So now that I've told you how exciting it was to survey them, unfortunately, they feel exactly the same way as the over 18s about this technology, almost matched. And I've been racking my brain trying to find something that differentiates how they feel. Their concerns are exactly the same sort of results as older people. Their acceptance of it as whether it's safe or not, exactly the same. So what do you do with that? I think we've really got a job ahead of us around bringing the community along with us for this journey. And it's really important to target areas that they're concerned about, understand what they are, and communicate with them. So young people are aware, and they're also concerned.
Yeah, communicate. So Eddie had a question about who has liability in case of an accident. At Rossmore, we're going to get into data, but for the last question, but who has liability?
I thought you were looking.
I'm going to give Tim. Yeah, that's Tim.
Come on.
CCTA has the
Yeah, exactly.
It's there's a $5 million requirement for insurance on this pilot. If you get an authorization from DMV, you have to carry a $5 million policy. So that's in effect. Typically, it'll be. I've been to Rossmore a couple of times, have been invited to speak for Rotary there, and I noticed that they're not the greatest of drivers. And so this is a great spot. Why Rossmore is because it's probably the best sandbox to test this, because there's no signal lights. And so it's going to be easy from that perspective. So you're going to come to a complete stop, make a left across traffic, and that'll be okay. So let's get into data for Tim. So Tim, you've asked a question about how to get a car manufacturer to share data, which they often view as a competitive advantage. Let's start with you, Jen.
There is data that is shareable, that I would share if I was a car company, and there is data that I would keep. There's information that helps an industry to learn and to grow, and I think all the participants in that industry start to understand that shared information for innovation, especially in something so hot topic as this, is a good thing. But we don't expect off the bat for these car companies to go and say, here's my proprietary information, which makes my product different, makes it better, and I'm going to share it with the world, because that's actually ridiculous. What we do realize that within data, and our data scientists can tell you, there are patterns, and there are certain types of data that others can learn from. For instance, a lot of this will be based on sensors. Now, sensors sensors are not as reliable. However, they do have some what we call data attributes. The position of which they sit, what they see. Is it similar to other sensors out there? And that data is categorized to where they're willing to give that out because it's beneficial to the industry. And a lot of times, if they want their car to work, it's got to communicate somehow with some other piece of information. So it's a give and take. In our system, and what we're trying to describe here is, if the car companies all get together and the industry gets together, similar in the financial industry, and agree that they can start to set rules that everyone can live by for the benefit of the entire industry, and this has happened in most major industries that we look at, then they'll start to coordinate their activities. And they'll start to share what they realize is important to the industry. And your information to breed innovation comes off of similar data points. And you learn to see patterns and become predictable. And this is all what AI is talking about. So these companies have a benefit by sharing. It's kind of a give and take. And that's how it should be established. And it's, this is out there for this, and this is out there for this. And on top of all that, we're hoping that one day, in a perfect world, we can create a fair and open marketplace to where we allow the public members and the stakeholders of the data, who are consumers and suppliers, to put that information out there in a contractual way for open bidding, similar to you see financial contracts. So we can actually establish a pricing mechanism that will allow data to move faster, because there's no questions on the contract price. And that's actually how futures and commodities contracts work today.
Yeah, we're actually not looking at validity of the sensors, the location of the sensors, which equates to the whatever randomness of errors. What we're looking at, this is the reason why we started out on a very high level, is can we get the analog brake system going off information at location X over and over and over again, and then relay that to the owner operator to say, you might have a skidding problem here, because typically the engineers don't go out to look at that until you have some events, and those are generally injury-related accidents and/or fatalities. And then also hard braking. We think we can get that information, once again, not judging the validity of the sensors, but just saying at location X, there's been a lot of hard braking events, so we go out and take a look. Is it somebody can't see the stop sign? Is it a mistimed light? Are people getting frustrated? Is it a geometry problem? And so that's really kind of how we started, because we don't want to get involved in the data war with the OEMs currently, because we want to start this out right. And then another question was the Freedom of Information Act, and that's something that we struggle with. When we first formed Gomentum Station, we were being requested for information on a weekly and/or daily basis for all the information related to Google, Apple, NVIDIA, whoever. And we have to supply all that information. We redact certain information, key information that we can redact, but we have to send all the information. And we're a staff of 20, and so Lindsay Willis and Terry Ann Grover in the back there would come into my office and go, oh my God, we got a CPRI request from Guardian newspaper and/or Time magazine or whoever it was, and they're complaining. And so we ended up creating a nonprofit status that kind of sheltered Gomentum Station away. And so we're looking at, you know, how do we do that when we sign your NDA, right? I'm sorry. We want to make sure that we don't violate the trust that you have placed in us. And so, does anybody else have one last question for anybody here? I'm going to give you that opportunity. Just raise your hand, stand up, and ask the question. Nobody?
Can I just, on the data exchange, so our partners, so there's 130 partners in the ADB collaboration. A lot of them are competitors, they compete with each other, and mining companies who've been running automated trucks for 10 years have got a lot of experience. The only thing they share on is safety. So I think that, you know, if we start off with some of these safety critical information. I was at AVS last year, and there was a whole discussion about safety, and there's always this question about, oh, government, you tell us what data you want, and then data says to industry, well, show us what data you've got. You know, we've got to move past that conversation, and some of the stuff that you're talking about, you know, that braking, that's really good for engineers like us who, you know, want to make sure we, you know, keep the roads safe and we can be proactive and not wait for crashes to occur to go and intervene. That's really, we think that that should be categorized as safety critical information. I don't, you know, let's start with the easy non-proprietary things and find a use case for them that, you know, makes citizens safer.
Great. Well, join me in thanking the panel for their participation. I appreciate that.